Great. Good evening. It's really wonderful to see you all here. I'm Dina Mansour. I'm the executive director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. And I have to say I'm a little off my game because we haven't had an in-person activity like this for a long time. So thank you all for being part of this. This is exciting. So as you know, the Mansfield Center fosters globally minded leaders of integrity. This is our 40th anniversary year, actually, like with the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. So we really need to partner more on our 40th anniversary activities. But because we have this commitment to integrity and public life and engaging with our citizens, Mayor Hess has graciously agreed to give us a welcome at our first in-person event. Jordan?
Thank you. Thanks, Dina. And thanks everyone for being here. It is it's an honor to be on the stage talking about democracy and a delight, really. It is one of my favorite topics and something that, given the state of our world, given the state of our national politics, and given particularly recent events in state politics, is something we need to be talking more and more about. So the topic tonight of bolstering democracy in around the world resonates with me, and I think it's something that we need to all be talking about collectively, really for the good of our community and for the good of our world. We have organizations represented here that truly believe in the transformative power of government. And I share that belief that local government in particular can be a transformative force for good in the lives of the residents that we serve. It can be a place where it should be a place where people can be represented without fear of repercussion, without fear of violence, without fear of a degradation in their quality of life. A safe space where they can shape their community and have their needs met. And I believe that to my core, and so I'm really glad to be helping introduce the folks behind me tonight. Maintaining a system where people can work civilly without threats of violence is just such a core aspect of our democracy. Here in Montana, I've had the opportunity to reach across the aisle and across the state to work with mayors around the state, particularly during this legislative session. We've had mayors from small towns, large towns, Roundup, Missoula, very different politically and geographically, and coming together around this notion of working on local decision making and working on protecting our democratic institutions. And I believe that that's bearing fruit and that work needs to continue. So again, delighted to be here. I want to thank the Mansfield Center for putting on this event. I want to thank our guests for flying out from Washington for a quick trip, and I want to thank the University of Montana for hosting us.
Okay. All right, so I'm not going to get too deeply into introductions. We only have an hour today. We have about 300 people joining us via Zoom. We have a great audience here of high school and university students, community leaders, and people who are deeply committed to democracy here at home and around the world. So you've all seen their bios, so I'm not going to go over those. We're really honored to have these two leaders from Washington, D.C., who are stopping in between, trips to Australia, trips to Nigeria, and here they are in Missoula, Montana for a little under 36 hours. So we have Ambassador Derek Mitchell representing the National Democratic Institute. We have President Dan Twining here from the International Republican Institute, and a tremendous honor to have our own local judge, Leslie Halligan, here serving as moderator. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I will turn it over to Leslie to guide the discussion tonight.
So thank you so much, Dina, for the invitation. It's certainly my pleasure, and I'm very honored to be here to ask some questions. Long ago, I was in part of the journalism school at the University of Montana, so we'll see if I have any of those skills left. So I'd like to organize this a little bit with some just general introductions and just to learn a little bit about both of your institutes so that folks can get a better sense about the work that you do and the work that your institutes and staff do. And also, if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about your different perspectives so we can get a sense about your mission. I know that both of you work much more globally, and so many of your questions will be more international. And so after your introductions, we'll speak about your work. And then to the extent that we have time available, we'll try to apply some of your work to how we can perhaps improve our democracy and our democratic principles. So with that, Dan, if you'd like to begin a little bit and tell us more about what the work the International Republican Institute does.
Yeah, great. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting us, Mansfield Center, all of you. Really wonderful for us to visit out in the country. We spend a lot of time running around the world. Our organizations were founded in 1983 by President Ronald Reagan and a Democratic Congress. His vision was to support the aspiration to freedom around the world, including behind the Iron Curtain. He had the fundamental insight that the values that we all care about are universal. They are not culture specific or geography specific, that people behind the Iron Curtain then wanted to be free to speak, to worship, to associate, to choose their leaders, and to depose their leaders peacefully in elections. The National Endowment for Democracy has a set of core institutes, including the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. We're actually nonpartisan organizations. One of us has a Republican board, one of us has a Democratic board, but our view is that supporting the campaign for democratic dignity around the world is not a partisan or political affair. It's something that should unite all Americans. It's very powerful to us to see this work in action because it is demand driven. People all over the world, both of our organizations work in more than 100 countries. People all over the world want the same things that so many of us take for granted in the United States, which is a voice, a vote, chance to speak freely, a chance to practice politics free of fear of coercion or persecution, depending on one's political views, and the hope for a better future for their children. So we're very proud of the work we do. We see it as being strategic. I'll stop, but just to say that in the world that we are looking out at, there are authoritarian actors in Russia and China and elsewhere who would like to dismantle the free and open world that America and our friends and allies built, this world of democracies, now over 100 of them, that citizens have made great sacrifices for around the world. They would like to dismantle that order and replace it with one that is not safe for universal values. So we have a lot of work out to do in the world, including so that America can remain free and open and live in a world that is hospitable to our values.
Derek, if you'd like to
Sure.
also explain.
Well, first, thank you very much. Nice to see you here and everybody here in Missoula. This is my favorite spot and stop of the year. We may go travel the world, but I love coming out to the country and talking about what we do, because I think it's not understood oftentimes what we do and how we do it in this democracy support sphere. And I want to thank the Mansfield Center. To show the bipartisanship, I associate myself completely with what Dan just said. I mean, I think everything he said, I share. Absolutely. And just to give you a bit more sense of what we do and how we do it, though, because I think Dan did a great job of laying out the general what and the why. But we look around the world and we see people that are struggling for democracy. We've seen it since the 1980s, people who are making the transition, who said, you know, we want a different future. But it's not natural necessarily to know how to form a competitive political party, how to run competitively in elections, how to form a parliament that has certain oversight functions and organized as parliaments are meant to do, to create civic organizations. I mean, these things are not necessarily natural for people that don't have a culture of that we take for granted in the United States. So as they make that transition, they've looked for support. And what we do is try to provide that support, not by necessarily exporting America. Some people say, oh, you're just going around saying America is perfect and you're going to show them how it's done. We're not perfect. Democracy, American democracy has never been perfect. No democracy is perfect. Every democracy is a work in progress. To be a democracy is to be a democracy that is a work in progress. But what we can do is we can share experiences. There are different forms of democracy around the world, different experiences people have had. And what we do is we bring people from all over the world, take those experiences to other places that may be more analogous than America. We're a more developed democracy, and say, this is what we've done. This is how we've done it. And in doing so, very importantly, show solidarity, show support. So as they go through that difficult time, they feel like they're not alone. It's very, very important. And it matters. it matters that we have a more democratic world. We can talk about why. Dan may have mentioned it, but a more democratic world where people have a voice, have dignity, believe that they can work internally to change their governments peacefully, makes for a more stable society, makes for a more stable region, makes for a more stable world, makes better partners, trade partners, allies. It works for US interests. So what's good for the world is good for the United States and good for our allies. And that's why what we do, we continue to do it. We see things happen that we think are going forward, some things going backward, but we continue to stand aside the small d Democrats around the world to show that they're not alone.
So thank you very much. So I have a number of questions, and this order may not flow as well as I'd like, but I'm going to start with some of our very tried and true principles of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Can democracies exist without these freedoms? And if so, how can they be established or increased or supported to help promote democracy?
No, you can't have democracy without freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Those are fundamental values. I mean, democracy is, you need to have oversight. Democracy disaggregated is essentially transparent institutions, transparent information of governance, accountability of government, being able to oversee and change governments on a periodic basis by the will of the people, including everybody equally in that process, under law, under rule of law, where there is an independent judiciary. Those are the fundamental, if you disaggregate it, those are the fundamentals. And you can't have a democracy without oversight of a free independent media, free press, a voice of people, ability to associate, to discuss, to share information, share perspectives openly. You shut that down, you don't have a democracy. You can't have a healthy discourse, and you will not have results that reflect the will of the people. So if you don't have transparency, you'll have abuse of power. If you have no accountability, you will have corruption. I mean, it's just human. Madison knew that. He would talk about that in the Federalist Papers, that if men or people were angels, you wouldn't need government. You wouldn't need democracy. So you need to have checks and balances in a democracy. That means ultimately that ultimate check is people and the people in these institutions. And that means press, freedom, and civic freedom.
So I had an opportunity, I think, to just watch a little podcast, perhaps, that both of you had been involved in, trying to bring in what I would say as smaller actors in the conversation of democracy, and the concern that perhaps when we're discussing democracy around the world, that kind of the large countries or countries that are in the press get more attention. And so in your work, how are you trying to be inclusive with these very many countries that are interested in democratic principles?
So we work all over the world, in countries big and small. We work in small countries like Moldova and Kosovo. We work in big countries. And what's interesting is there's just as much politics in small countries as there is in big countries. Sometimes it's more personal. Sometimes it's even more strident and polarized in small countries. But small countries play a really important role. Maybe I could just flag two quick ones. One is the country of Moldova, which is a frontline state in the war, the Russian war on Ukraine. Putin's plan was to kill or depose the democratically elected president of Ukraine over the course of essentially 2 or 3 days. And then the army was going to keep going west. Hopefully it was not going to invade NATO, but Moldova was the soft target on the doorstep of Ukraine that has a very pro-Western, pro-European, very committed democratic reformer who wants to embed her country in European and Western institutions. And she is in the crosshairs of Vladimir Putin. So that's one case of a small country, only a couple million people, where the work we do, I think, counts and is strategic. Because guess what? No one in Moldova wants to be part of a new Russian empire. They've already done that and they didn't care for it very much. I would like to also mention the island democracy of Taiwan, which Derek has deep history with. Taiwan is on the front lines of freedom in Asia in the same way that Ukraine is on the front lines of freedom in Europe. Freedom House ranks Taiwan as Asia's most free and open society. Now, here's the thing. It's a Chinese society, Chinese culture, Chinese civilizational history, ethnically Chinese. And every day it puts the lie to Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party premise that Chinese need a strong hand. And they shouldn't have things like elections or free media or civil society organizations, because that would not be good for China's development. Guess what? Taiwan is 3 times richer than China and is a much more successful and peaceful society than China. It does not threaten its neighbors the way China under Xi Jinping does. So I would maybe flag those two. There are many others, but just to underscore the role of how strategic it is to support Democrats, small d Democrats in these countries who are doing the hard work of trying to make meaningful democratic reform, and also, frankly, in the case of both Taiwan and Moldova, to fight terrible authoritarian propaganda and disinformation and essentially information and economic warfare from their giant neighbors.
So are there things that we can learn from Taiwan's commitment to democracy and their economic growth that can help to spread and support these other smaller democracies, especially in light of the fact that they're kind of under the cloud of this military threat often?
I'm happy. Derek really wants to take this question because he
Alright.
lived and worked in Taiwan.
Go ahead, Derek.
Oh, I am? Okay. Well, the reason it's not just a deep history. My wife's from Taiwan too. So it's a personal history of Taiwan. Yes, we can learn a lot from that. I mean, one thing you can learn, I mean, they are on the front lines on the information war from China. When they had an election, presidential election in what was it, 2020, I guess, they were attacked by the mainland and cyber attacks. And they found a way to fight back and be resilient to those. We can learn that. We can learn those methods. There are folks in Ukraine, in Estonia, in Taiwan, who have been attacked and have figured out better ways than we have of being resilient to them. So we absolutely can. Any country, every country. In fact, Russia will try out stuff in the Baltic states and their border, or in Ukraine years back, and weren't paying attention, or China in a place like Taiwan that they'll then use on us or other countries. So they are the canary in the coal mine, and we should be watching everywhere. China and Russia are not saying we're just going to go after the big countries. They're going after the small ones too, to test things out and to try to push the wave to their side, because every country is a vote in the UN. Every country is a petri dish for their interest in shaping a world that's safe for autocracy.
So speaking of, I guess, both China, it certainly is exerting its authority in many ways, and how it's also promoting what in terms is a democracy. So I believe one of the questions from someone in the audience was with regard to their whole process people's democracy. So have you heard of that term?
I mean, we're very flattered that they think they need to use democratic language to justify one-man rule, right? That's a sign of the power of democracy. Xi Jinping doesn't get up and say, yeah, I'm a dictator and I'm proud of it. He says, oh, we have Chinese-style democracy, right? Our development model is superior to the West development model, even though China's 4 or 5 times poorer than Western countries, and is never going to allow the kind of innovation and freedom that produces true prosperity to flourish. So we should be flattered by the Orwellian use of language, but we should take it quite seriously, because China is positing under the Chinese Communist Party, under Xi Jinping, that they have an alternative model. And I think this is unusual for Americans, because after the Cold War, you know, there was a sense that democracy and freedom are the only way, right? If you want to be a rich, successful, productive society. And Xi Jinping is now saying, no, there's another way and our way is better. And strangely, this is very attractive. Actually, not strangely. If you're like a dictator in Africa or Latin America, this is a very attractive proposition, that China can provide you a surveillance suite to keep an eye on what your citizens say online, to essentially prevent them from organizing and colluding against the government peacefully, that China can instruct a ruling political party essentially in how to hold on to power forever and never cede in a free and fair election, how to tilt the playing field so that the political competition never has a chance to get off the ground. So we should take this seriously. It's a real ideological challenge.
Derek, would you like to add anything with regard?
No, I completely agree. The only thing I'd add one continent to that, which is Asia. I was ambassador in Myanmar, and their term for democracy, the generals, was disciplined, flourishing democracy. And it's like, okay, discipline, flourishing. And they opened up a bit for a time, and now they've shut it back down. The generals have. But that is the model. It's what China's talking about. It's what the generals in Myanmar are talking about. And more, as Dan said, China is exporting the ability to have discipline, democracy. So, their surveillance suites in countries so that the government can follow everything the people are doing. Can't make a phone call, can't do anything with digital devices or just walking the streets that are not surveilled. It's very dangerous. I mean, this is Orwellian. And they're on the march. They are exporting this stuff, and the autocrats are calling it democracy and appropriating these terms. And I think we can't be complacent about this. We have to go out there assertively and describe what it is we're talking about when we talk about democracy. And when we talk about human dignity, I mean, basically it's about human dignity, individual rights, individual voice that really dominate. They're in charge. And what they're saying is about the glory of the state. And what we're saying, it's about the dignity of the individual. It really comes down to that. The glory of the state versus the dignity of the individual. And they're going to try to appropriate our terms, the terms that seem to appeal. And we need to be out there assertively promoting these values, because it's not just about others out there. What happens out there is going to flow back here. It shapes a world that does not work for our interest down the line, and it'll make for a less secure world over time. So we have to pay attention.
So you've talked about disinformation and misinformation and the campaigns that I think have been instituted and perhaps nearing perfection, or certainly permeating many of our societies. And I think it's difficult for people to understand really the depth of these invasions. Certainly we have the internet, which is a wonderful means of communication and information gathering, but it's also much of a source for this manipulation and misinformation. Are there ways that we can strengthen our democracy, work with others to ensure that their people are not being misinformed and disinformed, and the chaos that ensues? And how are you working in this area, and what should we be doing?
Well, this is a critical question, really important one. I mean, information, as we were saying earlier, is the lifeblood of democracy. You can't, if you don't have good information, if you don't have facts or an understanding of facts or acceptance of facts, then you can't have debate, you can't have a real discussion, you can't have a good policy and propose. So this is where, again, the autocrats, or even those who want to assert their own authority or political advantage within countries, try to poison the information space in order to subvert the democracy and take advantage of that. And it's extremely dangerous. The online space is very easy to do. It goes faster and wider and deeper than any other way of spreading information. The social media companies are essential to this fight. Their algorithms are seeking to contribute to division and hate and extreme views. They're not taking responsibility for this. The people who get online have to also recognize and be literate. We call it digital literacy, know what they're looking at, maybe get off the screen, talk to people, do more, investigation on their own of what the facts are, and engage like this. I love that you said it's the first time that we've been, or you didn't say, but Dina said that it was the first time that we've been in person. In democracy, you can't do it through a screen. You can't connect. Democracy is about community. It's about standing in front of each other, and maybe half of you are Republicans, half Democrats, I have no clue, but engaging, talking, communicating, compromising, whatever it is, exchanging. And so you get a feel for somebody else. But the information now that people are getting are through screens. It's often subverted or poisoned, or it makes people feel good about their positions when it may not be the facts. And we've got to, it's very hard. We are focused on it. When I came into NDI, I established what I call the DemTech division, democracy and technology. But to solve this is a much more complicated problem. I can't say I have any easy or quick solutions for it.
Any thoughts?
So countries that have handled this issue well, that are on the front lines of essentially digital disinformation assaults, a country like Estonia, in the case of Russia, assaulting it, a nation like Taiwan, in the case of China. I think in some ways they have concluded the answer is not a technical answer. The answer actually does involve having civic education, having citizens who can navigate authoritarian propaganda, identify it, spot it, who can understand what is fake news and what is objective reporting. I think we would all love to find a technology solution to this problem that has polarized us and torn us apart as a society. It's very frustrating because open societies are much more vulnerable to information operations, propaganda, forms of extreme disinformation. Open societies are much more vulnerable to that than closed societies because they're controlling the information space. So in the absence of a terrific technological solution, we can look around the world at places that have handled this issue. And a big part of handling it and navigating it involves having engaged citizens who can use sound judgment. So they don't believe the first thing they see on social media and take to the streets in outrage. And we need some of that here, just like democracies needed around them.
So you raise, of course, an excellent point with regard to educating individuals so they both can be literate, understand, and be engaged. In kind of preparing for this, I read about some of the Northern European countries who have many years and who pride themselves in educating all of their citizens so that they can be more involved in government. We've had, lots of discussion about education, both in the United States and I imagine in other countries. Are there specific areas that we should be focusing on? Is it just a matter of educating and providing this ability for people to discern information? What are suggestions that perhaps your organizations are doing to help engage people, change the apathetic view, and get people involved in their governments?
So part of it is having an engaged and active citizenry, including an engaged and active younger generation. In so many countries, actually every country in the world, young people are underrepresented in voting, in politics, and political life. Getting them into the arena to exercise full democratic rights is critical. Young people are also much more technologically literate. So actually they may come up with great solutions. I mean, a lot of the young civic activists that NDI and IRI work with, they're a lot younger than Derek and me, right? These amazing people who are fighting disinformation, who are navigating the contest against authoritarian propaganda. There are various ways. I mean, it's hard to talk about technology and digital in one conversation because, of course, there are things like e-governance that Northern European countries have pioneered, right? There are wonderful technology platforms that actually connect citizens with governments, with government services that make government more responsive to citizens. There are secure platforms that democratic dissidents can use in closed societies to get around that surveillance suite that wants to prohibit their participation in civic and political life. There obviously, we work closely with tech companies to support democratic actors abroad who can use some of the great tools that companies like Microsoft or Google have to offer. One thing to think about as we think about the future of technology, last thought from me on this, is that cutting all the American technology companies, breaking them up, cutting them down, won't necessarily fix the problem, because you might then find that you're living in a world of Chinese technology giants, right? So I think we have to navigate these issues quite thoughtfully.
I would answer beyond the technology question. Just looking at civics, as you may talk about, citizenship is a job. To be, and if people are in charge of, democracy is ruled by the citizens, then you have to take that responsibility seriously, and we have to educate people and develop citizens again, and be very mindful about it in schools or in society. And that means knowing the fundamentals about our system, understanding about what the dangers are, what the responsibilities, that it's not just the rights. The rights are important, the right to speak, the right to associate, the right, whatever the rights are, but the responsibility to listen, the responsibility to engage, the responsibility to compromise. These civic-minded, this is a culture. Democracy is not just the institutions. It's not just a political party or an election. It's a culture of how you engage with one another. And that can be broken pretty quickly. It can be broken any generation. Every generation has to fight for that. And it's very hard to build. But that also has to be kept in mind. And it has to be carefully taught, as the song goes. You have to carefully teach it. And I think we in America have sort of drifted from that. I think we can learn from other countries that have done that better, and make people aware that this is a responsibility. And if, as you know, people like to quote Franklin, what do we have after the Constitution? A republic, if you can keep it. We have to keep it. We can't be complacent.
So the engagement that you speak about with young people, I know that Mansfield Center supports a lot of exchanges across the country. As a student at the University of Montana, I've participated in an exchange and went to Austria and then traveled through Berlin at the time that the wall was still up, so prior to the wall being removed. Certainly my observations of, at that point, kind of the communist rule and the authoritarianism was, deeply seated. And so to what extent is this engagement promoted through these types of programs?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we do. It takes time, can take a generation or more because these things are embedded. So they may think we want to be like when the wall fell, they would say, well, we didn't like the Soviet style, it left us behind where America's rich and powerful. They have a democracy. Well, we'll take that because it'll make us rich and powerful tomorrow. It's not that easy. And they found it's not that easy. And they say, well, we can have an election. They may rush an election. And then the old guard changes their suits. They form a political party first and they get elected, maybe, or the opposition gets elected and they don't know how to govern because they've been in opposition, a bunch of activists. The old guard organizes themselves, waits around and comes back in. So you have the same guys, and typically they're guys, doing the same old thing, just with different rules, getting the same results. And then people say, well, that's democracy? Hold on. Well, I thought we were going to be rich and powerful tomorrow when, and then they get frustrated by saying, well, democracy didn't work. No, it's much more complicated than that. And, you can build a road tomorrow. You can have an election tomorrow, but a change of mindset, change instincts of people that have been educated a certain way, or that takes generations to do. And it's hard. And so I think one of the things we didn't do in those days, and I wasn't around so much then, but doing this work, was we have to be mindful of our expectations and make them manage their expectations of how easy this is going to be. Essentially, it's going to be hard, and it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be simple. And I tried to do that when I was ambassador in Myanmar, when there was reform during my time. I would tell them, this is hard. Don't think this is going to be easy. America had, black men were being shot in the streets during the Obama administration with impunity, it seemed. And I would say, look on TV. We still have racial problems in America. We still have divisions in America. We're still doing that after 240 years. This is not easy in a society that was similarly divided by ethnicity or religion. But the alternative, going back to that, is, the way you've done it, I don't need to lecture you. It's creating a weaker society. Do it better than us. Find ways forward. That's the lesson you can take from us.
Can I just volunteer on this topic? Because the fall of the wall, obviously, and the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe is an obvious historical moment. There was another one, which was the Arab Spring, which is very interesting to think about in retrospect, because I think the lessons are a little different than maybe what conventional wisdom suggests. The Arab Spring, 5 dictators fell from power, including in really meaningful countries like Egypt, some of the most populous countries in the world. So it's not that authoritarians held on. There were civic protest, peaceful protest movements. In some cases, Libya, there was more of, civil war, etc. But dictators fell. And then the question was, now what? And the answer in these societies was that strong men had run police states. There was no civic life. There were no political parties. There were no independent institutions. There were no independent judges. There was no free media. The building blocks were not there. And millions and millions, hundreds of millions of Arab citizens' hopes were crushed because they saw it as a dawn of freedom and a new day. And they said, what's happening in the Middle East here, just the first term of the Obama administration, what's happening is like what happened in Eastern Europe in the late 80s. And it was for some of the strong men who fell, but the building blocks were not there. So that's not a failure of democracy. There were no democratic institutions or processes. That goes to Derek's point that this work is hard and it takes time. And our institutes work in some tough places that are not successful democracies, but we're trying to work with brave people on the ground there to lay these building blocks, because you never know. In Belarus, someday that dictator is going to fall. There is a very active and robust civil society, and a woman who won the presidential election there in 2020. She actually won the election and the dictator just never recognized that, right? So there is an infrastructure, there's a democratic infrastructure in that country and in other countries that is waiting, hopefully, to seize the chance to take the country in a free and open direction. But it's a reminder that what is failing is not democracy. What is not working is, frankly, the legacy of autocracy can be prohibitive in countries that don't have anything underneath that police state. So we have to think about that. The building blocks of democracy, as Derek said, are not government. Most of the building blocks of democracy are things like civil society, are things like independent media. And so let's think in a bottom-up way, not just a top-down way when we assess the state of democracy in the world.
So when you talk about these countries that really don't have the underpinnings for democracy, there's also the concern that other autocracies or other leaders will come in and swoop in and kind of take over. Are there mechanisms in place or programs that you think have been particularly helpful to try to encourage those building blocks to start forming and to keep out other ruling elitists?
So it's hard. It sort of depends on the nature of the transition, right? In some cases, it's a negotiated transition where, ideally in Burma someday, the military generals who usurp that country's democracy will step back. They'll say, we can't do this anymore. This country is ungovernable. And there's a negotiated transition with civilians. Burma actually had this in the early 2010s. When you were working on this issue, Burma never had a true democracy. Burma had a hybrid system where the generals essentially had a veto over civilian democratic power. There are other cases where a government is discredited and falls, right? In Ukraine had the Euromaidan revolution, a peaceful street revolution in 2014 that deposed a leader who had become a dictator and who was answering to Moscow. He literally fled to Moscow. I mean, he was like a foreign agent running this country. In that case, Ukrainians were able to come in and pick up the pieces and continue to build a real democracy in that country because that regime had been so discredited. So a lot of it depends on the nature of the transition.
It's very hard to institute that, but in places, as Dan said, whether it's Belarus or Burma or others, and there's in fact somebody I think in this room who's going to be going out and assisting with Burmese small d Democrats who are now outside the country, who had been elected in 2020 before the coup, and still organize themselves. So it keeps, what we try and do in places is keep that flame alive, try and work with people that are credible. Hopefully they have some connection inside the country. Because if you're in exile too long, you lose credibility with the people that have remained inside. But trying to find a way in closing spaces to keep this flame going, keep the democratic. So if something changes, they can come in and there can be a fairly peaceful and smooth transition.
So I have a few questions from folks who are joining us remotely. I'll start with the first. How do you respond to failures to achieve democracy in places like Sudan, much like these warring generals? Many Sudanese citizens have understandably soured, and there is frustration that the Western democratic presence that they feel has abandoned them. Is this a failure of foreign intervention or a shortcoming of democracy being attainable in all situations?
That's a great question. We may have a different understanding of Sudanese history. Sudan had a dictator for 30 years named Omar al-Bashir, who was a war criminal indicted by the International Criminal Court. He was deposed in a peaceful street revolution in 2019. But what came out of that was 2 years of hybrid rule, where 2 generals and a group of civilian activists essentially tried to create a democratic opening and begin to build a democracy. 2 years into that experiment, in 2021, those 2 generals overthrew the civilians and seized power illegally and illegitimately. Those 2 generals governed the country for 2 years, and now they're fighting against each other, right? That's not a failure of democracy. That's a reminder of how autocracy drives a country into the ground. Sudan should be a rich, successful, open society. It has a lot of attributes and endowments, given where it sits, given its resource base, et cetera. And hopes in that country have been crushed by men with guns, right? That's not a failure of democracy. I think there is an argument that the world maybe could have done more to support a Sudanese democratic transition, it's also a great example of foreign interference. It's not the West who's interfering in Sudan. There are a number of Arab countries who have essentially picked sides in this internal battle. Some of them support one general, some of them support the other. That's what's going on in Sudan. And as a result, hopes for democracy and freedom are being crushed and people are fleeing that country.
Anything, Derek?
Well,
that
just
you-
maybe one, and it gets to a broader point here, is people often talk about the decline of democracy. And I think I referred to this early on. It's less a decline of democracy that's a concern, but that democracy is under attack around the world. So it can be from within by military generals who are seeing more coups around the world, or from outside by autocrats that are trying to shape and corrupt systems. So the demand for democracy is strong. In Sudan, there were women on the front lines, young people on the front lines demanding change. And then guys with guns squashed it. You see that in Nicaragua, you see that in Cuba, you see that in Burma, you see that in Ukraine, you see that in China with the white paper movement last year at the end of COVID. I mean, in Thailand, you see it, in Hong Kong. I mean, you go down the list around the world of people that have said, a majority of people say we want change, but are not allowed it. So is that our fault? Can we do more? That's debatable. Maybe we can do more. Ultimately, it's not going to be up to us to succeed. And that's where we have to also manage expectations. India and IRI are not going to bring democracy to countries. They have to own this process. We can provide the opportunities and plant seeds and give them the solidarity. They've got to do it. But, you know, our chair was Madeleine Albright for years. She used to say if she couldn't be Secretary of State, yes, she wanted to be chair of NDI. And we always took that very close to heart. And she was, you know, I miss her every day. But she used to say imposing democracy is an oxymoron. You can't impose democracy. You can't do it for them. It has to be ingrown. It has to come from within. And you see that energy, and it comes around the world from young people and from women, particularly, not to denigrate guys, but, you know, we made a hash of a lot of stuff, but you gotta open the aperture, and the energy is there, but people are not allowing, particularly guys with guns and others, are not allowing it to flourish.
So there's a great movement toward preserving our environment. And in Montana, we have specific constitutional provisions to have a clean and healthful environment. I know that this issue generates a lot of support amongst young people in particular. Do you see movements like this enhancing the opportunity for countries to both address environmental issues and also promote democracy? And if so, how?
Absolutely. This is one of the practical, you know, we say what's important for democracy. It goes to the point of transitions and people getting frustrated. Democracy has to deliver something for people. You know, if people look at it and say we're getting the same results or actually worse results, we don't have jobs, we don't see you know, there's unfairness, there's corruption, people will sour on the democratic transition. Even if it's not democracy's fault, they'll sour, and then allows a demagogue to come in and say, you know, this messy process that you don't like in Tunisia was like this, you know, it's messy. It's Parliament. I just have to take power. Only I can fix it. Give me the reins. I'll do it. So you have to show some practical results. This is where climate is interesting, and what we're thinking about at NDI, which is that, as you say, this is probably the issue that galvanizes young people everywhere. If you want young people to be engaged and to be active in their society, to bring change, it's climate that will likely, in many places, that will drive that. That's a very practical application of democracy. Organize yourselves, vote, go out and pursue this goal, engage your governments, demand change. That's democracy without calling it that. It's not an election, though you can vote, but that practice of owning your citizenship, of being a good citizen, and ensuring your government and the world saves, you know, the future for you. That's individual voice. That is democracy in action. And yet you'll hear young people say, oh, democracy, we don't like that, but we want to do all this. Well, that's democracy. That's exactly what we're talking about. So I think there is hope. And then we are thinking about that very specifically, of how we integrate that type of very practical stuff into what we typically do, which is not interested in a particular theme or policy. We'll just say build a political party, or just a pure democracy, as you might call it. You know, how you do this process or that interaction, but maybe applied democracy is the way to make people feel like oh, this works for me. I want more of this. And then people will say, oh, I see why this works for me, and that helps ingrain the notion of democracy within societies.
It certainly brings forward the generations that are rising into leadership positions. We have one other online question, and that's how do economic issues impact the development of democracy in countries around the world?
Great question. Bullseye. That's where politicians underperform in so many cases, right? The quest for power, they then find themselves in power and they need to deliver. And often what has gotten them into power are economic grievances. And so people are then looking for broad-based prosperity. And politicians are often not the best people to deliver that because they don't have economic or business backgrounds in many cases. So a great way to discredit democracy is for politicians to fail to grow the economy and provide inclusive prosperity. You see that all over the world. One reason I care so much about democracy and freedom is because if a government achieves overweening power over political life, it's also quite likely to exercise overweening power over economic life in ways that will keep a country poor and most of its people unfulfilled. So I'm for limited government, which is why I care about democracy, checks and balances, constitutional oversight, citizen activism, because governments should not stifle economic growth. They should free entrepreneurs and corporations do great jobs. Governments actually can't do that in any country. Governments cannot employ the population. It's the private sector that's going to do that. But guess what? The most prosperous countries in the world are open societies. Why? Because they have rule of law, secure property rights, peaceful resolution of business and other disputes, checks and balances, institutional accountability. There's a reason that many countries, including in Asia, places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, there's a reason many of them started as dictatorships and became flourishing and successful democracies. It's because rapid economic development produced big middle classes who demanded political rights, right? These things go together. So then we need to hold our politicians accountable when they don't deliver the economic goods. But my personal view is government is not going to be the solution here. We do need economic competence in government, but a lot of that is creating the right regulatory and legal framework so that the private sector can flourish.
Any thoughts on that, Derek?
Always thoughts on stuff, but no, I mean, it's study after study says democratic societies outperform others. I mean, you can take a snapshot and go, oh, well, look at China or look at Singapore, but MIT study said that over a 25-year period, the development outcome is 20% better than autocratic societies. And it's just fundamental. I mean, governments that are accountable to people, that have to have regular elections, and therefore have to think about the broader interest, will then be responsive to that interest. Autocrats, just think about the where they take their orders. They're scared of their people. They don't care about the wider, they care about a small cadre at the top that they need to keep happy in order to preserve their power through force. Security forces or oligarchs or whatever it is. So they're just taking care of that small segment. And typically that means corruption. That means buying them off. And international, foreign countries can figure that out too. And they'll pay them off in order to get concessions on resources and such. So it's just the incentive structure in an autocracy is to take care of those who will keep you in power. And that's a very small cadre. And in democracies, you have to be responsive. It's almost obvious in that sense. But that doesn't mean that autocracies can't deliver in short term. Often they're starting from a very low base. They grow by double digits. They throw a lot of resources at it. If you have China, you have a market of 1.4 billion people. So businesses are falling over themselves to get access to it. Those are special cases, but the fundamentals are such that they undermine themselves over time because they start to chip away at those fundamentals of an open, innovative, entrepreneurial, fair society that starts to eat away at the foundations of that success.
So yes, that's just what we're headed for. Please stand and just give us your question.
Oh, perfect. I love a good microphone. I know I'm standing in a room with a lot of political science majors, so I know this kind of sounds like an obvious question. But how would you define democracy and why do you think that it is the best system for countries?
It doesn't solve all of a society's problems, I think sometimes we sort of think democracy is going to create heaven on earth. It doesn't, right? All human beings are fallible. Human beings design democracies and maneuver within them. Democracy prevents mob violence. It prevents civil war. It protects might makes right. It protects against might makes right, right? You don't get guys with guns imposing political outcomes. You get citizens determining political outcomes and choices. So democracy is morally clearly the best system because it is, I think we just believe as Americans that government should serve citizens and that it's our country. The country doesn't belong to the leader. Sometimes you meet authoritarians and they talk about the country like it's their personal property, right? American government officials don't think that. So there's that. But Derek made the point, democracies do actually outperform over time and deliver the goods. Now, I don't think any of us is satisfied with any democracy in the world. They could all do better, including that of the United States. But democracies actually have a pretty compelling track record of outcompeting autocracies, out-innovating them, producing much greater prosperity over time than authoritarian systems, attracting talent around the world to come to them, as in the case of the United States, Britain, Australia, other such immigrant societies. Our friend Matt Kroenig at the Atlantic Council wrote a wonderful book about this that I recommend to you, about how over history, democracies have actually outcompeted autocracies, because it turns out inclusive politics and accountability and transparency is a competitive advantage, right? So I think you can make a functional case for why we should believe in the system, but frankly, the moral case is perhaps the most compelling one for many of us, because we all want to have a voice in the future of our country.
So let's hear another question.
Do you find that the need for leaders in a democratic society to please the populace so they get a re-election, does that affect short or long-term thinking? And if so, how would you deal with short-term thinking in democracy?
That's a very good question and a very important point that, look, the incentive structure for politicians in a democracy is just to win that next election. So it can be both good and bad. I mean, positive in the sense that they have to be accountable, they have to listen. And if they want enough votes to win, they got to be responsive. They have to be responsive. On the other hand, it could be very parochial. If they're looking for just enough here, just enough there, they can do things that are just pandering to a particular base or pander to a particular part of the citizenship and not, as you say, look long-term. And that's true about businesses, true about politicians. It is, democracy, as Dan says, is not perfect. And there'll be those who say, well, you know, autocrats, they don't have to think about the next election. They can just think about the national interest and look long-term. Well, there are not many people like that. There are not many leaders like that. So you try to balance those two between those who are accountable to people, and this is fundamental to what a democracy is, that leaders are accountable to people, and then ensure through the vote, through how we engage with them, that they think not just short-term, but long-term. We have to hold them accountable. We have to be the ones to ensure that they think in the ways that they need to in order for them to get our vote.
Another question from the audience.
And this will be our final question.
Oh, I thought we could get two in. Yes. Yes. First question.
Yeah, I'm wondering how the recent efforts to undermine our own confidence in our own democracy and our own elections have affected your abilities to work globally.
Answer first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Look, what happens here does matter. People are watching, and it affects the way people view, because democracies, we are the standard bearer for a lot of people in the world for democracy. So there's concern, particularly from allies. They'll look at this and go, shake their heads and go, oh, what's happening over there? And there may be some, you know, the Chinese and others will pound their chest and say, see, democracy doesn't work. They're going to say that regardless. They're saying that when democracy works well, when it doesn't, they're always going to find fault because it's in their interest. So there is a concern. With the work that we do, though, practically, it doesn't affect us, because people around the world are saying they're struggling for their own rights. They're struggling for their own dignity. They're looking to achieve things for themselves. And they're looking for anyone who can assist them. And we can provide lessons from our own experience. Again, we can now tell them with humility, with true humility, this is not easy. Look at us. We're struggling just like you. Learn the lesson of this. Don't do it that way. But we know when we do this a different way that we're stronger, we're more secure. So we can use that as a lesson. But fundamentally around the world, people are not looking at us and saying, well, now we should, fight for our dignity now because America doesn't get it right, or America has never gotten it right. Of course, we're always struggling. So sort of yes, in a way, that what happens in America matters. And I think we have a responsibility in a way to be that model. I mean, it sounds arrogant, but I've traveled the world and people look up to America and say, well, if you can't do it, what chance do we have? I remember hearing that 30 years ago in Pakistan when I first worked for NDI as a youngster when I was 5, I think. No, anyway, whatever it was. I remember a jurist there said, if you can't get that right, what chance do we have? It was more like he admired us so much. He wanted us to succeed. So I would look at it more as a responsibility that we have as Americans, that people look up to that, not with arrogance. We should take that with humility, but also as a responsibility to try and do better, but not prevent us from going out there and assertively and confidently say democracy is still the best form of government for all other reasons that we've talked about, and not try to kind of self-flagellate and say, oh, we've done so badly, therefore we shouldn't go out and help others. That would be wrong. That would be completely wrong, because people are asking for the help and they appreciate that help. And in fact, it is part of American soft power. If we don't do it, there are not a lot of others who will.
One last question. While we get that question, I want to make sure that we thank you. We might be going off the air, but this last question, ma'am?
Thank you for the opportunity to ask. So you've both talked about education and information being really important to combat disinformation. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on our, in some areas, refusal to teach things like critical race theory, to eliminate some books, to not allow people to look at implicit bias, and how that might contribute to the fall of a democracy.
I'm not worried about the fall of American democracy. I worry about the suppression of free speech on campus. I worry about the lack of free and open debate, that we need to be able to politely discuss our differences and engage in genuine, vigorous debate in the spirit of the Enlightenment about all the issues, including the issues you raised, right? So this is fundamental to democracy, and there was a lot of pressure. I mean, extending maybe Derek's last point from the last question, democracies around the world are under pressure from disinformation, from foreign malign meddling, from polarization, social media induced difference. The United States is not unique. We are all grappling with the pressures of modernity, just as we have throughout our history. The issues we are grappling with, we are not the only ones grappling with them. I have great faith in the future of the United States. I think we need to reflect on our own history, the fact that we've overcome enormous obstacles in building a more inclusive and just society. I think we should be proud of that instead of ashamed of that. And we know we have a lot more work to do. And so we should be able to have a vigorous debate and discussion about all issues, right? That fundamentally, that is the spirit of democracy and pluralism, and attempts to shut that down are dangerous.
So thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause for our distinguished guest. So we so appreciate your time tonight, and we know that it's been very inspirational, and hopefully will help to spur many more folks in their efforts to achieve democracy worldwide. So thank you. And thank you all so much for attending.